All right, with that, we're going to kick off our webinar today. Hello and welcome to another Mass Medic webinar. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications. If you're not familiar with our organization, we are a membership-based trade association that works to bolster the medtech industry, primarily in New England, through networking, education, events like this, advocacy, and awareness. Today, we have a great webinar focusing on things to consider when developing electronic implantable devices, brought to you by our friends at Sunrise Labs. I will be turning the conversation over shortly to our expert panel, but before I do so, just want to share a few housekeeping notes. Everyone who registered for this program will receive a recording. It is being recorded today. You'll also receive a copy of the slides. And we are going to have ample time for Q&A. So please feel free at any point in the conversation to put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer them during the time allotted. All right, without further ado, I am pleased to turn the conversation over to Adam Jacobs. He is the CTO of Sunrise Labs, and he will be our moderator for today. Adam.
Thank you. Welcome to everybody for coming. This is a webinar about things to consider when developing electronic active implantable devices. We have three panelists today. Myself, I am the Chief Technology Officer at Sunrise Labs. Sunrise Labs is a 120-person contract development company. We develop products for other people, and they tend to be complicated electronic software systems kind of applications. So one of the great things about working here is we see about 30 projects a year. So we see quite a wide diversity of projects and companies, and you learn a lot when you go through that many types of projects, and we just feel like we have some good things to share with the community. Also on our panel is James Mitchell. He is a radiation oncologist and presently the Chief Medical Officer at Veris Health. And also we have Kevin Sweeney, who's a Senior Fellow Product Design of R&D at Resolution Medical, which is a manufacturing design company for implantable components and housings out in Minnesota. We're going to turn it over first. We'll hear from Dr. Mitchell, and he'll be discussing the clinical side of implantable devices. So take it away, Dr. Mitchell.
Great. Thank you, Adam. And yeah, thank you to Sunrise Labs and to Mass Medic for the invitation to speak today. Very excited to be here to talk about the clinical side of active implantable medical devices. As Adam mentioned, I'm a radiation oncologist. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I am Chief Medical Officer at Veris Health. In addition to being an oncologist, I've been involved in research and development of medical technology, including implantable medical devices, for over a decade. And at Veris Health, we are a medical technology company with a commercial product that is a technology platform for virtual cancer care. And our product is a combination of medical devices as well as software and data solutions for oncology teams, cancer patients, and the families of cancer patients. And so I'm here to provide a little bit of clinical background and clinical insights into kind of where we've been with implantable medical technology and where we're going as technology improves and we expand the indications that are out there for clinical use of active implantable technology. So if we start with kind of traditional active medical devices, these implants have typically been implantable therapeutic devices where you can implant a technology and it will remain in place and provide a therapy for an extended amount of time. Kind of the classical example of this is the cardiac pacemaker. in the world of cardiology, but also in the world of neurology. We've had deep brain stimulators for patients with movement disorders, peripheral nerve stimulators as well. And these devices continue to be used in large numbers today, but they've really evolved over the years. The last decade or so has seen miniaturization of these types of devices so that they're smaller when inside the body, but can also potentially be implanted in different anatomic locations because of a smaller footprint. Improved battery technology has allowed these devices to have a longer lifespan or a smaller size. And we're even seeing inductive recharging to prolong the life of these types of devices. But these devices are also now becoming data gathering tools as sensors and communication technology allows the device to not just be a therapeutic, but also an information gathering system so that the clinical teams can view longitudinal trends from a patient, understand their disease a little bit better, and even be proactive in the management through turning back and programming the implantable device to better meet the patient's needs. So in addition to improving on existing technology, we've seen implantable medical devices enter whole new indications or disease diagnoses. A real success story here over the last kind of 10, 20 years has been continuous glucose monitoring. Now this is a combination, typically a combination of implantable and wearable. But this technology has revolutionized the way a lot of patients manage their diabetes and really empowered patients to have tighter control over their blood glucose. And we've seen improvements in diabetes outcomes as a result. But if we go back to cardiovascular diseases, we've also seen the emergence of new technologies that are providing insights into a patient's disease. Devices such as insertable cardiac monitors that can monitor cardiac rhythm over the span of many years as a diagnostic tool in patients that we suspect may have an arrhythmia, but it's been hard to diagnose, or patients with a known arrhythmia that we want to understand, better what is the burden of their arrhythmia. And we've also seen the emergence of pulmonary artery pressure monitors, a device called CardioMEMS that gets implanted directly in the pulmonary artery in patients with congestive heart failure. And we can now track longitudinal trends in the pulmonary artery pressure, which is a marker of kind of cardiac status and fluid status, and can allow us to do what's called goal-directed therapy in CHF, where we can really optimize a patient's medications based on these daily longitudinal trends, and also receive some insights into patients that might be at risk of decompensation and hospitalization. And then the last kind of bucket of devices that I want to bring up are some of the more traditional surgical implants that really have kind of been viewed as hardware. This could be orthopedic implants like a hip replacement or a knee replacement, or vascular implants such as stents that have a mechanical function, but as technology improves and these devices start to be embedded with sensors and data communication technology, we can now gather data on the health of the implant or the health and recovery of a patient. So if we go back to the idea of an orthopedic implant, say like a hip replacement, if that hardware is now embedded with accelerometers or strain gauges, we can get a sense of the health of the implant itself. What are the stresses and loads being placed on that device? But also, what is a patient's activity? How are they doing with their physical therapy? How is their ambulation and their recovery after surgery? Providing those insights into the health of this patient as they get back into their normal daily life. So let's go to the next slide here, and we'll talk about, so what are some of the clinical benefits and challenges of new and emerging active implantable medical devices? Well, some of the clinical benefits are pretty obvious. If we think about those pacemaker-like devices, we can automate long-term therapy for patients that really need a therapy that can't be interrupted, right? So here we're pacing the heart, and we know that as long as the battery has power, the device is going to function, and the patient doesn't have to activate anything. The fully implanted device is just going to function in the background. But as we were alluding to, we're now developing the ability to capture longitudinal data about patients with chronic diseases. And so this is allowing for clinical insights into not just individual patients, but also populations of patients, so that we can understand disease processes better, but so that we can also be more proactive in the care of some of these patients with chronic diseases. The quality of data that we can obtain from sensors inside the body is really unmatched. So again, kind of going back to the idea of that pulmonary artery pressure monitoring device, monitoring the pressure inside the pulmonary artery is very difficult to do from outside the body unless you have access to an echocardiogram machine. But a wearable technology wouldn't really do that, and certainly couldn't do that accurately. But by placing the sensors right in the target organ, we can get this very high quality, high fidelity data that improves patient care and also allows us to run analytics to better understand these disease processes. When we look at the patient experience, and we think about patient comfort and long-term adherence and quality of life, this may be a little bit counterintuitive, but when we need long-term solutions, the patient comfort and quality of life is actually typically better with a fully implantable solution than with a surface or wearable or kind of partially internalized, partially external type of solution. And this goes towards the idea that any external device, if patients have to use this for a long term, there are real limitations to normal lifestyle activities, like limitations on bathing, limitations on the type of clothing that people can wear, certain activities. For an implantable device, once that initial hurdle of what's usually a minor surgical procedure is overcome and a patient recovers, all of those limitations actually go away. Implantable devices don't typically have limitations in bathing activities or clothing. And there's also no concern with patient adherence. Once an implant is in place, it's going to function, and there's nothing that a patient has to do to activate the device or control the device. And then lastly, we touched on the idea of expanding our physiologic sensing to new parameters. And as we start to think about miniaturized devices in multiple different anatomic locations, we can get access to new and exciting physiologic parameters that will provide clinical insights. But these are not a full slam dunk case in every situation, right? There are clinical challenges to adoption of new technology. As most of these devices are gathering and sending data, somebody on the clinical team has to review and interpret that data. So when you have busy clinicians that are already kind of overloaded in their normal workday, now we're adding data interpretation into that work. And so we have to make sure that as we develop these technologies, that the information that's being sent to the clinical team is neatly packaged, is easily interpretable, and is actionable. So it's going to have a meaningful impact and isn't just adding noise to what's already a pretty noisy workday. The devices and data that are new may not also fit seamlessly into existing workflow. So the data may not easily go into the electronic health record. If it does, it may not be easily interpretable or viewed. And so as we think about developing new technologies, we have to make sure that the entire solution fits seamlessly into the existing workflow and isn't going to cause a lot of disruptions. There are some new devices and technologies that require the addition of actual staffing on the side of the hospital or the clinical practice. So we have to take that into account as well. But perhaps most importantly, any new technology, any new source of data needs to have evidence to support its widespread adoption. That needs to be on the side of clinical outcomes, improving clinical outcomes, but also on the financial and economic side. Are we introducing a technology that's either going to be affordable upfront, or that's going to lower the overall cost of care in the long term through preventing hospitalizations or shifting care from the hospital into the clinic and into the home? So with that, I'll pass it back to Adam to get into some of the technology issues.
Thank you, James. So I'm going to discuss some of the considerations when you're trying to figure out what to do, how you'll design it, what your product is going to be. So I'll start by going over some basic architectural constructs. There are really two kinds of architectures for an implanted device, a fully implanted device such as a pacemaker, and there can be other types that have a portion of the device implanted, such as an LVAD or a Jarvik heart, and then you'll have some external drivers, and that's, we've had experience with both of them, and they do bring some different considerations. So what is the architecture of a typical implantable device? You can see that, typically at the center of it, there's a microcontroller that takes care of the function, the electronic functions. It typically senses something and provides some kind of a treatment. Any of these components can be, the devices can do some or all of these types of functionality. So you might have only sensing, only treatment, but typically there's sensing, treatment, and then there's often a special circuit for safety, which will be monitoring things to make sure that it's a mitigation for failures, and that it will operate in a safe way should failures occur. There's a often, if you're going to be a connected device, you'll have some communications out to an interface device, and that can be a number of different kinds of radio connections. The interface device, typically and historically speaking, has been a custom device, but we're seeing more and more devices who want to connect to phones or phone-like devices. The phones obviously have a lot of advantages. You don't have to design it as one of them. We have designed the customized ones, and it's a lot of work, and they change a lot. So people do want to go to phones, and everybody has one. That phone has great user interfaces, and they can talk to a server. The server then provides all the backside functionality for the client interfaces. So continuing on the architectural perspective, one of the things that we work a lot with are safety critical and high reliability architectures, and there are ways to design them in such a way to make sure that the safety is maintained no matter what happens, in failure conditions, for example. So we might have, to fail safe, it depends on what you mean by failing safe. There's failing operatively, and there's failing off. Most devices, most medical devices that we design are failing off, and there's just a cessation of treatment. But there are some, like, for example, well, certainly a total artificial heart. That was an architecture that would be a fail operative, and you do things differently. And so you're always balancing a few things. You might have redundancy in your architecture, and redundancy means that you'll have multiple ways to accomplish your goal. You might have multiple batteries. You might have multiple, like in an LVAD, you might have multiple motor drivers, multiple connections, multiple motors sometimes. And there's always a trade-off between redundancy and robustness, because redundancy needs to be done in a certain way such that you don't induce cascaded failures from failure modes. Like, for example, we have a special bus that there's two parallel CAN buses, and they're totally deterministic. If you have a failure, what goes on the bus does not change. And that's not the way people often do it. There'll be a failure mode, and all of a sudden there's a big flood of information on there, and other things start to fail. So those cascaded failures are something you really have to watch out for. And you might want to instead not do redundancy and rather try a strategy of robustness. Robustness means, say, for example, making a mechanical component thicker or stronger, or an electronic component have a higher voltage. There's a cost to both of them. They take space and usually more power. And there's always a lot of judgment involved in when to do what. Another thing is independent monitoring and alarming. If you need to be able to alarm reliably, that sometimes means completely independent power supply and alarming methodologies. And also swapping. Sometimes you can swap. There's a question of what is the needed swap time. In a total artificial heart, you have a couple of minutes. In an LVAD, in a stage 4 cardiac failure patient, you might have hours, and it depends on what your device is. So what that, you might have enough time to go to a clinical environment and just do a surgical procedure, or you might need to swap, like in an LVAD, you'll swap your batteries, for example. So you need to know your swap times, and that's an important thing to know. That didn't work. Power is always at the heart of implanted devices. You spend a lot of your time dealing with power and the limitations of what kind of power you have. And that doesn't matter if it's a big device or a small device. So how do you deal with, what are the things that drive your power usage? So one of them is just what features you choose to put in your device. If you put a lot of features in there, some of them can be quite power hungry. Some of them are not, for example, and that depends on somewhat of the measurement frequency. If you're taking a temperature measurement once an hour or twice a day, it really doesn't take any power at all. But if you're looking at an ECG or an EEG continuously, that can take a lot of power. And the more you put on, into the device, the more power it is, and the more continuous measurement it is, the more power it is. So those are things to look at very carefully to figure out what it is you really need for your clinical efficacy. Communications to the external world is probably one of the most energy intensive things that the device does. So you have to be cognizant of that and adjust all your desires for more data along with that, and try to reduce the communications by maybe pre-processing your data and sending out smaller amounts of data. Algorithmic complexity has always been true, and people have spent many, many years trying to get efficient algorithms for various things. There's lots of exciting things you can do, but it's not necessarily the case that you can do them inside of an implanted device. There are ways to reduce that power by doing more things in hardware, by having specialized hardware in an ASIC. There are things you can do. You can do machine learning kind of network outputs that are customized, and they can be low power. But in general, you'd like to make it as simple as possible. The sense and drive electronics tend to be sensing of interfaces to electrodes, and driving of some kind of an impulse or a stimulation tend to be specialized for implantable devices. You can, for example, in a stimulation environment, you often would like to do constant current kind of driving, but it actually turns out that sometimes it's more efficient to use constant voltage. So you might choose that, even though it's not really what you would choose from a theoretical perspective. Data storage always costs energy. You have RAM and flash ROM. Those things all take energy. The more you store and the more you keep, that all takes energy, and you have to calculate how much you have. There's a choice between using ASICs and commercial off-the-shelf chips. Commercial off-the-shelf chips have come a long way. They can do a lot. They work very hard to be low power. And by low power, I mean typically sub-microamp kind of currents that are being driven. You can get lots of chips now that are like that. A to Ds, op amps, the Bluetooth low energy devices are designed for low power. However, they can have things that they'll do that you don't want them to do, and they're not quite optimized for your application. And the downside of an ASIC is that the cycle time of development is measured in quarters, and every time you want to try something new, it's a long cycle time. Batteries are, of course, a concern. Primary cells, regular old batteries, is definitely what people want to do, because as James was talking about, they're easier for the patient, and there's no charging, there's no patient compliance required. So if you can live within the limitations of the primary cell, it's pretty much the way to go. But sometimes you need more power than that. So rechargeable batteries do provide higher power, but of course they require patient compliance and charging. There are different kinds of batteries. Some of them have higher density, some of them have higher instantaneous currents, and some of them have higher reliability, and you tend to trade those off for your application. For higher power applications like an LVAD, you would have very different requirements than a very low powered device. So that might be a place where you just don't have an option of recharging, and that might be why you would put an external pack, but not always. So if you do use a rechargeable battery, most people use transcutaneous charging with inductive coupling. They've come a long way. You can get pretty high powers nowadays across transcutaneously, but there are other methodologies of getting power, and there's been a lot of research and work in the field of energy harvesting. There's things like temperature rise and sugar harvesting in motion, and you could potentially use some of those, but they're very low energy creations. And if you're in the low microwatts, you might be able to, do something quite episodically, you might be able to use that. So, So connectivity is something that we do a lot of at Sunrise Labs. We've been making connected medical devices for quite a number of years. And that typically looks like a device, in this case, an implanted device, but any medical device talking to some kind of interface that talks to a server. The question that always comes up is where to do what. So one option is to take all this data and send it up to a server and use the giant power of a server farm to do everything you want. But the point is that in implantable devices, you're very power limited. And since communication is the limitation, very often the things that you want to do on the actual device are signal processing beforehand. And of course, you would always do safety operations on the implanted device. You never want to go out to an external device for something that's safety related. So typically, like for example, in an ECG or an EEG, it's about 10 times more efficient to do the processing, say for beat-to-beat detection and some of that kind of work, or some of the frequency kind of work you would do in EEGs. It would take about 10 times more power to send it out. So you would do that on the device, which is one of the reasons why you want to get your signal processing as simple as possible. Obviously, on the interface devices, that can be a good place to do the user interfaces, because we all have cell phones. We know what great interfaces they are. They have great communications. They can talk to. They typically have a cell phone and a Wi-Fi and a Bluetooth. So you can talk to the device from Bluetooth, and you can talk to the server over your various network connections. So typically, the server would be where you would do data collection, fleet management, and the back-end client processes, talking to clinicians and patients and any business needs and business workflow that you would do at Sunrise. We tend to build those systems, and we would go up to, for example, the device side, and then pass it off to, say, the enterprise systems for business management. That's a good way I like to say that people ought to think about it. That think of this as your medical device, and then you pass it off. And part of that is because your server has to be HIPAA compliant, and there's security concerns that are independent of your enterprise system. So you typically kind of draw a line between them. A couple of more comments about connectivity. The depth of implantation does matter. With basically the deeper you go, the more attenuation you have. People are bags of salt water, and it attenuates the RF. However, if you're transcutaneously, which is most of the implanted medical devices, say a pacemaker is not that deep, then the regular Bluetooth Low Energy 2.4 gigahertz frequencies work just fine. If you want to go much deeper, there are 400 and 900 megahertz bands that have greater penetration, but they have lower data rates. So the depth of implantation does matter. The connection interval is how often you'll talk to your external device, and obviously less is better for battery purposes. Connection consistency is something to consider, because you can't rely on cell phones or Wi-Fi to always have connection to your server, and you can't rely on the phone always being there to the device. So typically, you need to be able to architect your system such that the device can operate safely and perform its functions without that connection, and then have ways to recover when the connection is actually made. Sometimes that means throwing data away. If you go off to, I don't know, to the desert for a month and go on vacation, and then you come back, you might not have enough storage to store all that data if you're storing some kind of streaming data. Cybersecurity and patient confidentiality. The FDA is has guidance documents on cybersecurity, but they're just about to start requiring it. They already really require it in their submissions. So be ready to create an environment that is going to be dynamic, and you have to have a way to monitor security concerns and deal with them. So it requires a fair amount of back-end infrastructure to deal with that. A couple more comments about connectivity. One of the nice things about connectivity is you can do a lot of workflow management. And one of the nice things about phones, if you do use a phone, is that everybody uses them, or at least most people use them, and they're pretty ubiquitous. People know how to use those interfaces. Medical device compliance is always an issue when you're trying to teach somebody how to use something. Not all elder population are good with phones, but more and more most people are. However, phones can be replaced. The batteries can die, and you can break them. So you need methodologies of connecting to different phones. During implantation, you need to be able to get. Maybe you're talking about connecting to a clinician's phone, and then later connecting to other phones. So you need methodologies to do that. For example, having an authentication, which means knowing that you're talking to an authenticated person, and starting BLE connections and pairing. Things like out-of-band pairing, which means that you have a secure way of connecting to phone to a BLE device. And data rates and data quantity are just similarly to all the comments we had about connectivity, take more and more power. So you want to reduce that as much as you can. Finally, a lot of people are using machine learning kind of algorithms, or driven algorithms, and more people want to use them, and the FDA is supporting that. And there's lots of programs for how you can do that with the FDA. But one of the things that we hear a lot is that people want to be able to gather data from their implantable device and then upgrade their machine learning algorithms. And that's great, but there's a couple of things to think about. One of them is that you might be requiring a full data stream. And like we said before, usually you would want to pre-process data before you communicate it, unless the data is of low bandwidth, like use temperature, or maybe you're just looking at heart rate, not heart signals. So you have to make sure that that data is useful. And typically, in medical devices at least, usually you have to label your data to be useful for machine learning training. in testing. So the question is, can you post-label it? Because you're not going to have a gold standard. If you're measuring blood pressure, you don't have any other measurement to compare blood pressure to. So whereas if you have a cardiac signal, you can get a panel of cardiologists together and show them the ECG signals and have them label it. So you have to be careful that make sure that your data is going to be useful and be able to be labeled ex post facto. Whoops, did I skip one? I think I skipped one. Yeah. Sensing and stimulating is always an interesting topic, and it's a very dynamic field. There's lots of research going on in sensing and stimulating. We'll start with stimulating. One of the interesting things is when if you're stimulating something, you typically try to use what's called biphasic stimulation, which means you go positive and negative, which means you're putting the charge out there and you're taking it back. And the reason is because you don't want there to be a buildup of charge out in the tissue, which can cause both chemical changes because you're now providing a voltage into the tissue, but you can also affect your electrodes. You can have electrode degradation. So one of the things that's coming out recently is you'll do a charge balance, but then you'll stop and measure the voltage and use that feedback to see if it's really zero. And if it's not, you'll bounce it back to zero. So that's an interesting thing that people are doing now. Chemical sensing is something that we've worked on a fair amount. It is a very dynamic field also. There's, James was talking about glucose monitoring, continuous glucose monitoring. People worked on it for about a dozen years. There's lots of issues with chemical sensing, such as there's drift in the sensors, and how do you calibrate it, how often you have to calibrate it. The sensors get fouled and encapsulated by tissue. And so there's coatings for that. There's proton membranes that only let certain types of particles through. And there's a lot of dynamic work on it. And so if you're interested in all these things, I would just say keep informed on your field. I get the feeling like it's starting to become, there's certain parts of it that are becoming real, like glucose, continuous glucose monitoring. It took a long time, but it got there. So just, it's a dynamic field, and find what works for your particular application. Oops. So what are the takeaways? Make your product trade-offs wisely. I would say get a multifunctional stakeholder group together and really talk hard about what are the things that you really provide clinical benefit, what are the things you need to do, and then minimize everything to the essentials. One of the great concepts that we talk about a lot is the minimum viable product, or MVP. That's about, you want to get there as quickly to market as quickly as you can on the lowest budget, and you want to make sure that you meet the needs, but you don't want to overdo it. So really use that stakeholder group to create the right MVP, and be kind of ruthless about it. If something is only marginally helpful or even partially helpful, but it's not essential, minimize it. Reducing power is always an issue, whether it's a fully implanted device or a wearable implanted device. Even in a Java cart, you still were trying to get enough power and enough battery to be able to wear around, and it has a weight. So it was always the biggest issue, even something that large. And finally, use connectivity sparingly. It's a great thing. It provides a lot of clinical benefits. Make sure that it's the thing that you need to do. Make sure that the physicians are going to use that information, or someone's going to use that information in a way that makes it worth it. So that's it for me, and I will now pass it along to Kevin Sweeney.
Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it. I'm Kevin Sweeney. I'm a senior fellow here at Resolution Medical. And our company is also a contract design and manufacturing company, although I will say that we tend to focus more on the mechanical side, and also so in the context of this conversation, doing things such as assembling the cans or making leads and getting all of that stuff ready to go to sort of commercialization. Right now, I think we have about 170 employees here. The company's about 10 years old, and we're located just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is managing the development process. I work here on, we do a lot of work, everything from white page sort of product definition and early stage concept development to help companies raise money all the way through manufacturing on the back end. My role here tends to focus more on the initial stages, going from white space to proof of feasibility. And then once you get into the normal design control driven development cycle, then we would have a more standard product development and a product manager take over and drive that through validation and then ultimately commercialization, assuming success. I think there's been hints at it. I think Adam has done a really nice job of sort of laying out a lot of the potential sort of technical things to be considered when you're putting together a product. And I think also Dr. Mitchell has done a nice job of talking about the user focused parts of that. And I would say my experience, I've been doing product development for many, many years in a lot of different fields. I worked at Boston Scientific for 15 years, and I also have done some detergents and adhesives and biofuels. So I've kind of been around. And consistently, I think one of the key things is to really get a clear definition of success. And to me, that means really, it doesn't necessarily mean, as an engineer, we like to think it's going to work perfectly. And I'm not going to be satisfied until it does. But I would argue in the context of doing medical device development, that there's a lot of steps along that pathway that could also be deemed success. And as a consequence, so for instance, it could be getting to my next round of funding if you're a startup company. It could be getting to a preclinical study that proves one key technology area is working properly. So I think from our perspective, that's one of the things that really gets challenging and expensive is if the goalposts keep moving. And I know it's not intentional, but I do know that engineers are like kids in candy stores, and if you show them another opportunity to actually tweak a design, they can't hardly keep their hands off of them. So so I think what we like to do really when we during the early stages, and this is really where my expertise is really understanding what are the key risks to the program. And they could be technology based, they could be funding based, they could be regulatory, the approval pathway. You could have a very novel technology or that has a very limited supply chain, or that even may be still in development. And oftentimes this happens with extremely new technologies. It may be timing. In other words, you've made commitments to financial stakeholders or other stakeholders that you need to be in a certain test phase by a certain period of time. And the other thing is collaboration. And I think I've actually put this in a couple of times in terms of risk, is on projects where there are multiple expertise required to actually pull multiple various technologies together. In a case, for instance, if we were working with Sunrise Labs as a partner, it's really important that we really actively mitigate the risk of miscommunication between those two partners. And that's really what I mean about, is that a key risk? Could also be with the customer themselves or with whoever the ultimate design owner is. So those are important things. I like to, when we start projects here, I like to get a really clear understanding of what's really important in the near term and then what's really important in the long term. So, and then take a step back and sort of ask the question, what don't we know? What are the open items that we need to answer to actually move forward? As I say in the next point here, really the interfaces are a key place where the ball needs to be handled and addressed directly. We often work with partners that have expertise that we don't have in-house, and making sure that the design of those interfaces is owned by one of the development teams and is being actively managed is really a critical component of success. You can run off and do two developments of two parts that need to come together, and then they don't fit. And then usually you get to spend an hour in a meeting pointing at the other person saying, you didn't tell me. But in reality, it's really incumbent on partners to actually be actively engaged in those kinds of conversations, in my experience. Last thing is, one of the other key things that we spend a lot of time focusing on here is really the management of design development information. And this goes across the board on both sides. And this is really part and parcel of the design control process, and also something that is going to make things a lot easier in the future for making design modifications and continuous improvements. And you can go to the next slide, Adam. Thanks. So back to the beginning, the user needs definition, and this has come up several times in both Adam's and Dr. Mitchell's slides, that really being clear about, Adam used a great phrase, sort of the minimally acceptable product, or viable product, I guess is the right word, MVP, is really an important definition. If you can get agreement with that, and keep focused on that especially in the early stages, the design decisions you make in terms of both specific components and the interfaces are going to be much easier to manage. Pointing out, as Dr. Mitchell talked about, the intended users, and really having a good understanding. I think in the design control for ISO 13485 right now, it actually has a user needs document. Many times when I worked in the bigger companies like Boston Scientific, we really had a good understanding of the user needs because we were kind of doing incremental improvements in a given market. But in this space now, we're talking about startup. It's really important to really get a good understanding of how this is really going to fit into, I think Dr. Mitchell even mentioned the workflow, who's going to be touching it, how is it going to be used, and then make sure that we're taking those things into consideration while we're actually doing the design and the integration of all of the different elements. There are other requirements that after that are sort of, performance, marketing, regulatory, cost, manufacturability, that are also important. All of these things really are addressed within a typical design control system for a medical device. So it's just a matter of making sure that you're paying attention to them. And I also think early understanding if there are any priorities in it. Oftentimes we'll do development, and again, if you don't put a cost target on something, you're going to get something that's beautiful. You might, but you don't want to pay for a Cadillac when you're, or a Lamborghini when you really needed a Chevy. So, and that is a huge part of, again, back to the definition of success. If you get that stuff on the table early, it really encourages the team to start making design decisions that are based on really a whole knowledge of really how you get to the goal. So you can go to the next slide, Adam. So lastly, I'll talk a little bit about design for excellence really quickly. And this used to be called design for manufacturability, which has a lot to do with how component A fits with component B, and can you actually put component A and component B before you do the next assembly process, and then making sure that you don't put in elements that make things completely unassemblable or take a long time and expense to actually get them put together. We do have a process here at Resolution Medical that is formalized relative to this, but in our a lot of times our customers would prefer to defer some of this for cost reasons, but I think I would argue it's almost impossible to start talking about this too early, just because the interfaces, again, this is a critical interface. I've worked on one implantable device where once we actually got the sort of system built and the mechanical exoskeleton of the system built, and we tried to actually then load the electronics, it turned out that every time they loaded the electronics, it discharged the capacitor on the electronics and it basically emptied the memory. So they couldn't get the the firmware basically went away. The thing rebooted during assembly. This is not a good thing to have happen, and it's very late in the cycle for that to be thinking about that as you're maybe getting ready for some critical milestone test. So those are the kinds of things that we want to keep in mind while we're actually talking about the design stage. And again, this all really comes down to collaboration between partners. There are other design for modalities, if you will, reliability, quality, supply chain, testing, maintenance, cost, sustainability, product lifecycle. Most of these are really dealt with directly as part of your requirements and user needs on the front end of the ISO requirements for design controls. Very little of this, because you go through a process of looking at failure modes and what the effect is of that from a risk mitigation perspective. If some of these things are critical elements, they should be dealt with directly during the design and assembly stages. Some of these things might be controlled by process. Some of them could be controlled by user requirements and training on the back end also. So it's just important to make conscious decisions about where you're actually putting that emphasis while you're going through the design process. Automation in a lot of cases is great, and as long as the process is sort of reproducible. But you see, I've also seen examples where automation has actually just changed the failure modes from something that was human generated to something that's machine generated, and you need a different set of skills to troubleshoot that. So bottom line here, early and persistent review of the assembly of things is really important. We do it even with pretty simple devices, is make sure we know how to put things together in a reasonable way early in the process. And then I would say that most of the rest of the design for excellence modalities are really included in the ISO requirements. So if you're working with a partner like us, you're going to get a good review of that and a good plan for it while we're going through that early in the development process and planning cycle. And I think that's all I've got. Yes. So now it's on to questions. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for a wonderful conversation, everyone. Reminder, feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I do have a couple questions that came in. So the first one kind of deals with, you guys, we're all kind of talking about this a little bit, but the challenges in between a limited budget and prioritizing the trade-offs of the technological features and cost savings. Who would like to take that first question?
I mean, I can take it. I think this is really I jumped in front of Dr. Mitchell there. I think this is really it's a hard thing to do. You know, everybody wants, as we would say in engineering terms, to boil the ocean. The problem is that costs a lot, that costs money. And I think it's really useful I've even asked my customers, you know, if you want these 5 things, but if you can only afford 4, which ones are the most important? And having those conversations early is really important. I also work with customers where we give them as much as we can through this round, and then we actually defer some of the next generations into subsequent generations of devices. And that goes into a business strategy too. So it's very important to be engaged with again, the definition of success at that point. And now I'll be quiet.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. I think Adam and Kevin both hit on this really well when talking about, you know, identifying the needs for the MVP and sticking to that and not allowing you know, feature creep or mission creep to start to derail the project. And, you know, coming from the clinical side, you know, I feel like a lot of this begins before any development even starts by really identifying the clinical need and meeting with the stakeholders to make sure that everybody's clear about what those needs are. And then, you know, in terms of, you know, kind of the typical funding process and life cycle, if you're in kind of a startup environment, I think it's very important to have clearly delineated milestones that can prove progress, have data endpoints that also show value creation, and are going to kind of bump the valuation of your business up to a point where you can then go out and raise the next round of financing. So looking at the amount of financing that you have and determining what are those critical milestones that you can get to, and meet those milestones, and then use that to leverage the next round of financing. I think it's extremely unusual in a startup environment to have enough financing from the beginning to get to a commercial product.
And I just want to add that we engage with clients at all different stages, and there's a part of it that we call the formative stage, where you're trying to figure this out. And I think it is okay to, there's things that you're not going to know. Almost all our projects start out not knowing all the answers. However, you can try to really lock things down as much as you can, but then some of it's discovery. Some of it has to do with feedback from the field. Some of it has to do with technical limitations. So, if you can do what we call a phase 0, where you're trying to lock all that down and you're in a kind of a lower cost exploration kind of mode, then you can, some of that, it's okay to not know all the answers, and most people really don't. So just plan for that, but then converge as quickly as you can, is what I would say.
Great, thank you all. I think we have time for one more question, so I'm going to pick. So what are some best practices around how you determine the potential power consumption early on in the project?
That sounds like me. So typically we right away come up with a power budget that's basically a spreadsheet, and you put all the functions that you think you want, and then you have to decide on how you're going to do it, put an estimate of how much power it takes, and you make this spreadsheet. And it has a bunch of parameters, like how often you're going to measure something, etc., and what kind of chips you're going to use. And then what happens is it's an incomplete kind of estimate, because there's subtleties on how much power things use. You might, for example, one of the biggest things is microprocessors. There's things that you turn on and they take more power. You're given estimates from in microprocessors, whether it's an ASIC or not. And then once you start to actually use it, you realize that you need to turn some clock on, or some buffer on, or some input output device on, and that took more power. So the first stage is the estimate, but really you don't really know, I would say, until you get a little bit down the road and you're constantly refining it. So early on, sometimes what we do is we'll set up a simulation of what we think it's going to be, even on just out of the box development kits, and we'll try to measure power. And most of the chips, we can do that with. But then ultimately you put it all together, and there's surprises, in one way or another. So expect there to be iterative measurements on this.
Got it. Anything else to add, Dr. Mitchell or Kevin?
No, only thanks everybody for dialing in and listening in. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up today's webinar. I also would like to say thank you to everyone who attended, and thank you to our speakers. Adam, Dr. Mitchell, Kevin, thank you for your time and your expertise. Thank you, Sunrise Labs, for sponsoring today's webinar. We put these on very frequently, so please check our website at massmedic.com/events to find out what's coming up in the future. And we can't put on these great programs without your support, so consider that moving forward. As I mentioned, this is recorded, so everyone who registered will get this after the fact. And thank you again. We'll see you next time. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.